All right, hello. It's Wednesday, obviously, so halfway through the week. Congrats on that. Hopefully, you're seeing kind of a light at the end of the tunnel here. Just a couple more weeks for you, and you'll be able to maybe rest and relax just a little bit more with schoolwork out of the way. I want to reiterate as we get into this topic that whatever we end up saying has to be rooted in love. This is a very, very personal topic. I think we've kind of worked our way in a more increasingly personal topic as we've gone forward. And there are certainly emotions that will be involved. And that makes total sense that it would be an emotional topic. So we want to make sure that if we're going to be defending what we think of as the Christian view, that we do it in a Christian way. So if you are on the affirming end of the spectrum and you think that same-sex marriage is affirmed by the Christian viewpoint, you can't say that in a way that's really dismissive of other viewpoints and angry and even judgmental. That wouldn't be the Christian way to do it, and vice versa, right? We want to be rooted in love. Remember, we're starting with the traditional side of the coin, and we're going to do Old Testament today. Now, you might expect the Old Testament to be even more harsh, but actually there are fewer passages in the Old Testament that are directly about same-sex sexuality. So it's interesting dynamic there. We're going to look at the two major passages, but we're going to have a couple of presuppositions that I want to put in place. The first presupposition, and this is not limited to the traditional view, but the presupposition is that the Bible is authoritative in the life of believers. Now, when we say the Bible is authoritative, what we mean is that God, in His authority, has given us the Bible so that we have access to His Word. But that's a working presupposition that we need to have in place for this to be a fruitful conversation at all. If you don't think the Bible's authoritative, then why would you care what it has to say necessarily, other than as an academic exercise? So I want to root us there. The Bible is authoritative in the life of the believer. We need to figure out what is the authority expressing. The second thing that maybe I should have put in as a presupposition here is this idea that while it only speaks directly to same-sex relationships a handful of times, and in the Old Testament really only twice, those who are in the traditional view have a presupposition that says there's a context for this conversation, a biblical context for this conversation, where from beginning to end sexuality is depicted as heterosexual. That in a sense the plan as we see it throughout Scripture is heterosexual. Now that's a presupposition for the traditional viewpoint, and there is response from the affirming viewpoint, which we'll get into. But let's just dive into the two passages for today, and then maybe set up our time for tomorrow, which will be about the New Testament passages, which there are more of, and will probably require us to slow down a little bit. First one is in Genesis 19. It's a rather famous passage. You probably remember studying it maybe your freshman year with Mr. Bacher or it coming up. But it's about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's right after Abraham has pleaded for Sodom. But remember, the visitors have been with Abraham. Now they're going down to see what's going on with Sodom and Gomorrah. And what's happening here is these angels arrive, and Lot welcomes them into his home. Now, the translation for angels, that's an interesting conversation in and of itself, but the storyline's not necessarily impacted by it. So these angels arrive, and Lot brings them in, but then a crowd shows up at Lot's door. And we're not going to read the whole passage because it's extended. But this crowd shows up and they basically demand that Lot lets them out. Basically, they are intending to have sex with these angels. That's literally what the translation says in verse 5. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we can have sex with them." In a sense, what they are looking to commit is what we would call authoritative rape. They would like to demonstrate their power over these visitors, that they have authority over them, and it's, in a sense, going to be a gang rape. Now, Lot does something really odd here, and there's a lot that you might want to talk about if you were talking about just the passage itself. But for us, the conversation's about same-sex marriage. And the response from Lot is not necessarily a part of our conversation, but what he does is say, wait, why don't I give you my daughters instead, which I'm obviously very, very uncomfortable with. People talk about how this is a part of, the sense of hospitality and protection of visitors. Whatever the case may be, we ought to be pretty uncomfortable with Lot's response, I would say. But it also demonstrates to us that this passage is not at all helpful for our conversation. This is a text about violent sexuality. It's not about monogamous, committed same-sex relationship at all. It's not about love. It's not about anything positive. And so it's not really useful for our conversation. Now, some people will use it, but they're not thinking straight when they do that. Because our question is not, is rape okay? Everyone knows it's not. And our question is not actually, are, the random sexual encounters okay? Because I think the scripture is clear on that. If we think of scripture as authoritative, we clearly see that sexuality has a context. Our question ought to be, is a monogamous, committed, loving, same-sex relationship affirmed by Scripture? That's what our question is. And so this passage doesn't speak to our question, right? Our question is, could a Christian live a same-sex relation, live out a homosexual lifestyle in a committed, or we might say married, relationship, and still be, in the umbrella of the plan of Scripture for marriage, right? That's our question, and this doesn't address it. The other thing that's a little bit of a side note maybe is in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 49, what we find out is that Sodom and Gomorrah are not actually destroyed for this sexuality issue. Some people have lumped those together historically. They've called it even sodomy, right? And what we find out is that's not what they're being destroyed for. They're being destroyed because they don't take care of the poor, that they had plenty and didn't share. And so we have to be careful about trying to use Genesis 19. It's not really a useful passage for our question. A passage that might speak to it more directly is in Leviticus chapter 18. And what we see in Leviticus chapter 18 is part of the law. That makes sense. It's Leviticus. It's also in chapter 20. And you have these two verses that stand out in a sort of long list of prohibitions. The first one in verse 22 says this. It says, "Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable." And then in 20:13, it says this. "If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads." Obviously, very, very intense language. That word detestable sometimes is translated as an abomination. The death penalty being invoked. All very, very negative. We might say it's unremittingly negative. But there are a few caveats to this, or things that we should bring up. First, we would say is, okay, that's a part of the Old Covenant. There's plenty of things in the Old Covenant that we don't bring forward into the New Covenant. The most obvious and easiest one is food prohibitions. right? In the same set of passages, we can find, you know, laws about what you can and cannot eat, and we see that change in the New Testament. So just pointing to the Old Testament isn't actually a defeater to any viewpoint. The traditionalist, if they want to say that the Bible condemns, or Christianity condemns same-sex marriage, they wouldn't be able to rest their case on Leviticus 18 and 20, because there's plenty of things in these series of verses that don't come forward at all. There's a second question, and in part a question that has to do with really kind of technical translation work. But the second question is this about a holiness code for rites and rituals of worship, or is this about moral law? Is this about keeping the Israelites distinct from their neighbors in a holiness and ritual code, or is this about what is right for everyone everywhere all the time? And there is a word that's being used in both 1822 and 2013 that might be specific enough that some people say this is about a particular act that's being prohibited as a way of remaining distinct from their neighbors. Some people try to say that actually even these passages are referring to something authoritative, one person showing power over another. And so they would say even these passages are not about sort of universal condemnation of same-sex sexuality. And so that becomes a part of the question then too. Is this a time and a place, or is this a universal? Right? Is this a particular for the old covenant, or does it get brought forward into the new covenant? That has to be our question. As a traditionalist, we cannot just simply say, look, I read this verse, Leviticus 18:22, I'm done. The Bible's authoritative, I'm done. That's not how it works. Not for the Christian in particular. We have to ask ourselves, does this unremittingly negative prohibition about same-sex sexuality come forward into the New Testament? And also, is it a universal or is it a particular? That's actually a little bit challenging to look at, because we'd like to just look at what Jesus has to say. And I'm seeing a typo here I'm going to have to point out, but Jesus doesn't actually speak about same-sex marriage. He doesn't speak about homosexuality at all. There may be an explanation for why he doesn't, but he just doesn't. So we don't have the ability to simply look at what Jesus says and take it, as our solid foundation. He doesn't speak about same-sex attraction. He does speak about marriage, and that is fitting in with the sort of storyline of Scripture from beginning to end, from Genesis through on through. But it doesn't actually speak about our topic. So we're going to have to look at other passages rather than just what Jesus has to say. The other thing that's interesting about what Jesus has to say, and traditionalists have honored this fact, is that Jesus himself is tempted. We see that in obviously in the desert, but we also see in Hebrews that Jesus is tempted, but he doesn't sin. Now that's an interesting thing, because what it begins to do is it begins to sort of parse out our conversation. What becomes obvious, even to the traditionalist, is that actual same-sex attraction is not a sin. In fact, Worthian Christian affirms that. Same-sex attraction is not sinful, or not a sin. The traditionalists would say that acting on those attractions would be a sin. But experiencing those attractions is not a sin. Being tempted in any particular direction is not itself a sin. Otherwise, we would have a real hard time understanding how Jesus is perfect, because we see him being tempted. We see him being tempted in multiple places in Scripture. What we need to do, though, obviously then, is figure out what does the New Testament say about same-sex attraction, same-sex actions. And we're going to have to look at the writings of Paul mostly as we look at that, but also in the book of Acts we have a little bit of a nod towards our conversation.